The arrival of the academy floated above a quiet moon, far from war, far from fear, a place where young minds from many planets learned together, trained together, grew together. Its long silver halls were always filled with laughter or the soft humming of languages from stars unknown. Inside the gym, a wide-open chamber with gravity fields and moving floors, the students gathered as they always did. They were not soldiers, yet they trained like they might be one day. This was not a place of games. It was a place of testing limits. Rain stood near the entrance, his long tail curled close to his legs. He was not strong, not fast, but he came here every day because he believed effort mattered. Mira buzzed beside him, her wings tucked tight, her eyes scanning the floor. Instructor Vel walked in, his steps loud, his voice louder. Today was not a normal day. Today the gym doors opened, and someone new entered. He was tall for a student, taller than even Instructor Vel. His skin was light, not scaled, not covered, not furred, just smooth like polished stone. He carried no gear, wore no armor, only a simple dark outfit that hugged his frame like it feared falling off. His eyes did not search the room, they stayed steady ahead. A small bag hung on his shoulder. He did not speak as he walked. All eyes followed him. No one moved, no one whispered. Everyone knew what he was, a human. Rain's heart beat faster. His species did not even have hearts, but something inside him beat anyway. He had heard the stories, the ones told at night in the dorms. Humans did not come from a normal planet. They came from a place called Earth. A place where wind cut like blades and beasts hunted with eyes full of fire. A place where even the plants were killers. They said humans laughed when they bled. They said humans survived things others could not. They said humans came from a death world. Rain had never met one before. Now one stood in the same room, breathing the same air. Instructor Vel spoke again, his voice firm. Mixed relay today, teams of 3, no changes, no excuses. The human's name is Dan. He will be assigned with Myra and Rain. Made a clicking sound with her jaws. Rain's tail coiled tighter. Dan said nothing, only nodded once. The relay course lit up, climbing towers, spinning walls, zero-gravity tunnels, walls that closed if you moved too slow. This was not a beginner course. The instructor called for team placements. Dan walked toward Mira and Rain, calm, like he had done this before. Myra looked at him, not with anger, not with fear, just curiosity. Rain could not even look up. The buzzer sounded. The course began. The first obstacle was a long tunnel where gravity shifted in pulses. Rain struggled at once, his legs slipping. Dan reached out and pulled him forward, steady, strong. Rain blinked. He had not even asked for help. Dan moved ahead, not fast, not slow, just sure. He reached the wall climb. Aliens struggled there, even with gear. Dan looked up. Then he placed fingers into small cracks and began to climb. No gear, no tools. He moved like his hands were made for it. When he reached the top, he turned, waited for Mira and Rain. Mira flew partway, then slipped, hit the edge. Dan caught her arm, lifted her with one pull. Rain climbed slow, shaking. Dan never laughed, never rushed him. Next was the spinning zone. Mira adjusted fine. Her species had balance. Rain slipped again. Dan grabbed his arm, swung him across like a bag of leaves. They landed in a low-gravity area. Dan bent his knees, adjusted before jumping. He flew like he had done this many times before. Rain tried to match him, failed, hit the side, spun. Dan caught him again, helped him land. No words. Still, just quiet strength. The final part was the motion maze. Walls moved in patterns. One mistake and the floor dropped you down a level. Dan waited, studied the movement. Then he ran. He moved like water on stone, not fast, but never stopping. He reached the end, looked back. Mira followed. Rain stumbled again. Dan stepped back, pulled him through just before the floor opened. The buzzer rang again. Relay complete. Instructor Vel nodded, eyes unreadable. Dan stepped aside, wiped his hands with a small cloth from his bag. He looked at Rain and Mira. Then he said one thing. Fun warm-up, then silence. Rain stared at him, unsure if he meant it. Mira tilted her head, wings fluttering once. The other students had stopped moving. Some had not even started their relay. They had watched instead. The human had not roared, had not attacked, had not bragged. He had just moved with purpose. Aliens whispered. Some stepped back. Some stepped closer. Instructor Vel dismissed the teams. Dan walked out of the gym the same way he entered, calm, quiet, strong. Rain looked at Mira. "What is?" Mira did not answer. She only watched the door and the echoes left behind first impressions and tension. The sun outside the academy never moved. It stayed fixed in the sky, casting soft gold light across the walls of glass and steel. Time passed. Inside, through quiet routines and silent shifts. But today, the usual rhythm had cracked like thin ice under weight too heavy. Dan the human had finished his first gym class. Now he was all anyone could talk about, and the cafeteria lines moved slower. Tables once full with chatter now held hushed voices and sideways glances. Rain sat with his food untouched. His eyes stayed on the metal surface of his tray, but his thoughts were full of images. The climbing wall, the spinning maze, the way Dan moved. Without hesitation, the way he reached out with strong hands, not to hurt, but to lift. Mira sat across from him, wings twitching now, and then like nerves had no rest. She chewed slowly but never looked away from Rain. "You felt it too," she said, not a question but a shared truth. Rain nodded. "Once I thought he would be angry or loud or scary, but he was just fast, calm, strong." Mira tapped her claws on the table. "They say humans train with weights tied to their bodies. They say they fight storms for fun. They say their bones break and grow back harder." Rain blinked. "Do you believe that?" Mira paused. "After today, I might." A group of older students passed near their table, speaking low but fast. They did not notice Rain and Mira, or maybe they did, and did not care. One of them whispered, "That human is a machine." Another said he made Instructor Vel flinch. The third said he did not even use tools. He used hands like claws. The group walked away but left behind a thick silence. Rain felt something heavy inside his chest, not fear this time, something like shame. He had trained for 3 terms now, and never once had he moved like Dan. Never once had he made a course look easy. He glanced at Mira, who stared into the distance like her mind had gone far. Instructor Vel stood by the door, arms crossed, eyes sharp. He did not move as students left or entered, just watched. In his hand he held a small tablet screen. Dark in the training hall later that day, the relay course had been reset. Other students stood in place waiting for the next session, but fewer had signed up than normal. Whispers floated through the air. They say he could break the lifting frame. They say he ran on a volcano. They say his planet has beasts with 2 heads and fire breath. Dan entered quietly again. He wore the same simple outfit, no armor, no shield. Just that small bag again hanging from one shoulder. Rain stood beside Mira, already assigned for round 2. Instructor Vel called for warm-up laps. Dan started. Running, smooth steps, no rush, no stumble. Rain followed, watching from behind. Mira moved beside him, wings held tight. "Do you see it?" she said. "He never shows off, he only does what is needed." Rain nodded again. Halfway through the laps, the instructor changed the path. Now students had to leap across small gaps and shifting platforms. Rain missed once. Mira caught him before he fell. Dan had already crossed. He waited at the end, standing still, eyes watching, not judging. They finished the laps. Instructor Vel called for cool down. Dan stepped aside, began stretching his arms, legs, neck in smooth motions. "No noise, no struggle." Instructor Vel walked over, looked at him for a long moment. "You trained before this academy?" Dan nodded. "Back home, Earth." Vel asked, "What kind of place is Earth?" Dan looked up, eyes steady, rough. "But it teaches you to adapt." The answer was short, not proud, just real. Vel said nothing, walked away. The next day in the common hall, more rumors spread. They say he ran through fire to save a child. They say he once fell from a cliff and walked back up. They say his people breathe poison to build strength. Mira sat in the corner, sketching in her notes. Rain paced the floor, unable to sit. He was not afraid anymore. He was curious. He wanted to know more. He wanted to understand. When Dan passed by, they stopped and Mira spoke first. "We wanted to ask about Earth." Dan paused, looked between them. "You really want to know?" Rain nodded. Dan sat down, his posture relaxed. "Earth is hot and cold at the same time. It rains from clear skies and snows in summer. Animals hunt in packs with plans. Even plants sting and trap and burn. But we survive, because we learn, because we build, because we never stop. Rain listened with eyes wide, and humans grow. Up in this, Dan nodded. Most of us do. And the gym, how do you do that? Dan smiled for the first time. On Earth, if you are not strong, you get hurt. If you do not learn fast, you fall behind. So we push every day, not to be better than others, to be better. Then before Mira closed her notebook, so you do not train to scare others. Dan shook his head. We train to survive. Rain felt something shift in his chest again. This time it was not shame. It was something close to respect. The next day, a challenge. Notice appeared. 3 students from the elite combat track had called for a match. They wanted to face Dan in a controlled trial. No real harm allowed. Dan accepted without delay, no questions asked. He only said, "Tell me when and where." Word spread like fire across the academy. Every student knew about it. Within one cycle, Rain looked at Mira. "He is not doing this for pride," Mira replied. "He is doing it because they asked, and he never steps back." Rain nodded. "We will watch together, and maybe we will learn." Rising suspense and emotions. Notice board outside the combat hall glowed bright with names and time. 3 elite students had challenged the human to a match. Their ranks were high, their scores unmatched, their confidence strong. One came from the heavy world. Tribes where gravity crushed bones and made giants. One was from a winged race known for sharp vision and cruel speed. The third trained in low-gravity war zones, learning to strike without weight. They stood in the center of the crowd, heads held high, voices loud with pride. "We face the human tomorrow," they said. "Let the watchers see who truly deserves respect." Rain read the notice 3 times. His hands were cold, even in the heated hallway. Mira stood beside him, her wings tight, her claws clicking slow. "Do you think he will win?" she asked. Rain did not speak. He remembered the way Dan had moved the day before. Smooth like wind, strong like stone. But these elite students were different. They were trained for combat. They were born in warlike worlds. Dan never boasted. He never claimed to be the best. He never spoke of strength. He only trained. He only acted. Rain looked at Mira. "I do not know if he will win, but I know he will not run." Mira nodded. "Then we will watch." Crowds gathered long before the match. Even students who hated gym came to see. Even instructors who rarely appeared now stood in the corners. Instructor Vel took his place beside the combat ring. The floor shifted into a wide platform full of raised lines and defense tiles. Not deadly, just real enough to feel pressure, pain, control. Dan entered without noise, without speech, his steps calm. As ever, his eyes forward. He wore the same dark uniform with no marks, no symbols, only simplicity. The challengers entered loud and proud. Their uniforms sharp, their eyes bright. Each one larger or faster or smarter in some visible way. Instructor Vel raised his hand. "No harm to life, no strikes to neck or core. Points for control, points for awareness, points for restraint." "Begin." The air went still. Then motion began. The heavy world student charged first. His arms wide like hammers, his feet shaking. The floor. Dan did not back away. He moved sideways, turned and let the charge pass. Then tapped the back of the leg, fast, low, clean. The big student stumbled, caught balance, turned again. Dan was already gone. The winged one took flight, sharp, fast like a dart. He flew circles around Dan, trying to distract, confuse, overwhelm. Dan stood still, watching, tracking. Then timed a single step and lifted one arm. The winged one clipped it, turned too sharp, lost flow. Dan used the moment to place a mark tag on the wing. Point scored. The third challenger joined from the side, moving like air, light and quick. She used zero-gravity tricks, slipping between moves with sudden leaps. Dan adjusted feet, arms, vision without panic. He waited for her to come close. Then stepped inward. Instead of away, they almost collided, but he shifted, weight, spun, and landed behind her. He touched the back of her shoulder. Another point scored. The crowd watched in silence, not because Dan was winning, because Dan was calm. No anger, no roar, no attack, just response. The challengers regrouped. Now they moved together. The charge came from front, the flight from above, the trick from behind. Dan dropped to the floor, rolled sideways, and stood again at the edge. The 3 turned. Again, and moved in faster, this time sharper. Dan ducked, slid under a swing, and tapped the heavy world leg again. The winged one tried to grab him, but Dan twisted with the grip and used momentum. Both of them landed on the ground, not hard, not rough. Just enough to feel breath leave the lungs. The third tried again, but Dan grabbed her wrist, bent low, and guided her to the floor. No harm, just technique. Instructor Vel raised his hand. Match. Paused. The students rose one by one, each breathing hard. Dan stood without change, his face quiet, his breath steady. Vel stepped forward and checked the points. Dan had the lead, not by force, by skill, by timing, by reading movement. The challengers looked at each other, then looked at Dan, the heavy world student. Stepped forward and offered a hand. Dan shook it without delay. The winged one nodded, wings drooping, not from pain but from respect. The third bowed low and smiled. "You are what they say," she whispered. "But you are more. You do not fight to win, you fight to protect." Dan shrugged. "I fight because you asked, and I do not like saying no." The crowd clapped slowly, then louder. For the first time the applause was real, not forced, not polite. Instructor Vel turned to the students. "Now you see what true strength is. Not muscle, not speed, not blood, but control and respect." Dan walked away as quiet as he came. Rain felt something strange in his chest again. It was not fear, not confusion. It was something like pride. He turned to Mira. "We watched a human fight without hate. We watched a human win without hurting." Mira smiled, "and maybe we learned something we needed." Students left the hall still whispering, but not with fear, with questions, with wonder, with thoughts about Earth and humans and what it really meant to be strong. Dan returned to his corner and began to stretch again, like nothing had happened. He never asked who watched. He never looked for praise. He only trained, he only improved, and that made all the difference. The challenge, the sun still hung in its usual place above the sky dome, casting soft light on the training fields, but the air inside the academy felt heavy, like a storm waiting to break. After the match with the elite students, everything changed, not just in the Maiwa gym, but in the halls, the classrooms, the mess areas, the dorms. Dan was no longer just the human from Earth. He had become something else. A quiet storm, a walking question, a reminder that strength could live without sound. Rain walked the halls, hearing his own thoughts louder than the noise around him. Everywhere he turned, students were practicing harder, their movements sharper, their minds more focused. Even those who once treated gym like a burden now arrived early and left late. Dan never told anyone what to do. He only kept showing up. He ran laps, he climbed towers, he helped others without waiting for thanks, and slowly others followed. Not out of fear, but from something deeper. Mira stood near the center of the obstacle yard, watching a group try the wall climb. 2 failed, 3 barely reached the middle, 1 slipped and fell. But Dan caught him before he hit the ground. Dan helped him up, checked his arm, and gave a few simple tips. Then he walked away and started climbing the wall. Without pause, no gear, no tools, just fingers and focus at the top. He turned, looked down, and waved. The students below clapped without being told. Rain joined Mira, eyes full of thought. "Do you remember the first day?" he asked. Mira nodded. "We thought he was danger. Now he's the reason they train." Rain looked around. Even Instructor Vel looks at him differently now. Vel watched from the balcony, arms crossed, eyes following Dan's every move. The old instructor had seen fighters from many worlds, but none quite like this. Not because Dan was strongest, because he understood something the others had missed later. That cycle, a message came through the Academy network. An open invitation to all advanced students, a final challenge before the term closed, one that would decide rankings and honor. The course was designed for team trials. Only the best formed into squads and took part. Instructor Vel was in charge of the design. Rumors said he had added new zones built to test balance, speed, teamwork, and control. Not just brute power. Dan's name appeared on the list of selected students. So did Mira and Rain. Mira blinked when she saw it. "He chose us," she said. Rain read the message again. It was true. Dan had listed them as part of his trial team. 3 names, 1 squad, no backup, no replacements. Mira looked at Rain. "We train, but we are not like him." Rain stared at the floor. No, but maybe we do not need to be. Maybe we just need to try like he does. Instructor Vel called all teams to the arena the next morning. The stands were full. Other students sat together watching with wide eyes. Instructors from other departments watched too. Even visitors from nearby stations came to see. Dan stood near the start line. Mira and Rain joined him, their steps unsure. Dan nodded, once said nothing, just looked ahead. The trial began with a gravity tunnel. Most teams tried to push forward as fast as they could. Dan held a steady pace, adjusting his balance with each shift. Rain lost footing once. Dan grabbed his arm, pulled him back to center. Mira flew in short bursts, making sure not to overcorrect. They passed the tunnel without error. Next came the reaction field. Light pulses changed direction without warning. Any late movement earned points. Lost. Dan moved like he could see the pattern. He dodged left, then right, then ducked just before a low beam swept across. Rain followed, copying his motion. Mira read the pulses from above and warned them before the next shift. Their teamwork started to show not perfect, but improving. The next zone was the climb. Not just vertical. This wall had moving holds and false paths. Many students dropped halfway. Dan let Mira go first, since she could hover. She marked the best path with her chalk. Rain climbed with care, trusting her marks. Dan followed last, his hands never slipping. Halfway through, Rain slipped, but Mira caught his arm. Dan pushed from below, steadying his grip. They reached the top together. No one spoke. They just moved. The final zone was called the unknown. Instructor Vel had kept it secret. No one knew what waited inside. The squad stepped through a gate into a chamber of shifting light. The floor cracked into sections. Walls changed shape. Smoke hissed from vents. Sound played random echoes. The mind faltered. Some teams panicked. Dan took one breath, closed his eyes for a second, then pointed. That way. Rain and Mira followed. They moved low and steady. Dan took the lead, but watched both of them with side glances. He guided Rain over a broken floor tile just before it dropped. Warned Mira before the wall turned. They reached the core of the maze and found the mark. Dan pressed it. Lights shifted again. The exit path opened. They walked out into silence. Then the crowd stood. No one cheered. Not yet, just wide eyes and slow claps. Instructor Vel stepped forward, his voice steady. The trial is complete. One team finished with full score. 3 students from 3 worlds. Moving as one, he looked at Dan. You chose them. Dan replied with calm tone. They earned it. Vel turned to the crowd. This is what we train for. Not strength alone, but trust. Rain stood tall, his heart full. Mira smiled, her wings relaxed. Dan looked around once, and then walked away from the center. Not seeking spotlight, just done with the task. Respect earned. Story concludes. The arena lights faded into soft white as the last team stepped down from the trial zone. No more tests, no more races, no more challenges remained. The term was ending. Soon the students would leave. Some would return home, some would move to the next level, but today every thought was still wrapped around what they had seen. Rain sat near the practice wall, hands resting in his lap, eyes staring at the sky dome above. Clouds moved slow across the glass like gentle rivers of mist. Mira stood beside him, her notebook closed, her wings folded flat. Neither spoke for a long while, not because they had no words, but because the feeling inside them needed silence to grow. Instructor Vel walked by, nodding once, his face looked softer. Now not tired, not hard, just thoughtful. Students passed him with respect. No one looked away now. No one whispered like before. Dan had not just changed one day of gym. He had changed the reason others came here. Inside the quiet gym chamber, Dan stood alone. He lifted weights, not for show, not for numbers, just to feel movement, to keep the rhythm. His eyes stayed fixed on the wall in front, his breath steady, his hands firm. Behind him the door opened. Rain and Mira stepped inside. Dan did not stop. He placed the weight down slowly and turned. Rain spoke first, his voice clear. You made us better. Mira nodded. Not because we had to, but because we wanted to. Dan sat on the bench nearby, reached into his bag, pulled out a small container. Inside it was a cloth badge, plain dark blue, with one thin line of silver. He handed it to Rain without a word. Rain looked at it confused. Dan spoke. "You earned that more than I did." Mira leaned closer. "This is yours." Dan shook his head. "Not anymore." "You two stood beside me. You faced what others feared. You never ran. That matters." Rain held the badge like it weighed more than metal. He turned to Mira. "We should hang it in the hall, not for pride, but as memory." Mira smiled and agreed. Later that evening, a small gathering took place near the central garden. The sky dome above showed stars moving. Instructor Vel stood on the platform, his voice calm yet strong. "Today we finish not with ranks, but with lessons. Every year we see speed and power and control. But this time we saw more. We saw courage from silence. We saw growth through struggle. We saw unity without force." Dan stood in the crowd, not on the platform. He wore the same clothes as always. He looked no different. But every student looked at him with quiet respect. One by one, students came forward. Some said thank you. Some asked for advice. Some gave small gifts. Dan accepted each with a nod. He never changed expression, but his eyes held something warmer. Now when the ceremony ended, Rain stood before the gym wall. He placed the badge at the top with Myra's help. Students passed by looking at it. They asked no questions. They just looked and thought. That night, as lights dimmed and dorms grew quiet, Rain sat by the window. He watched the stars and remembered the first day. How fear had held his steps. How silence had felt like threat. How Dan had moved through all of it without anger, without force, without shouting, and how that had changed everything. Mira joined him, her notebook now filled with sketches and words. She opened it and showed a page. It had 3 shapes, one tall, one slim, one winged. They stood on a broken hill reaching for the same goal. Rain smiled. "You kept drawing." Mira nodded. "I wanted to remember this." Rain looked at the stars again. "Do you think we will ever meet another human?" Mira thought for a moment. "Maybe, but we may not need to. We already learned what we needed." Far from the academy, on a distant station, a report arrived. It came from Instructor Vel. It carried no decoration, no stamp, just clean words. Subject: human. Integration trial result. Success note: recommend further cooperation. Strength, not a threat. Value beyond prediction. Approved for joint training programs. And so the quiet change began to move. Other academies opened doors. Other species began to ask what made humans so different. And why did fear turn into respect? Dan left the academy a week later. He carried the same bag, wore the same clothes, spoke the same few words, but the hallway was full. When he walked out, students lined the sides. Some saluted, some bowed, some placed hands over their hearts. Dan nodded once and kept walking. Grain watched him go. Myra stood beside him, the gym behind them, the stars above, the lessons now part of them, not just of strength, but of choice, of kindness, of quiet power. The door closed behind Dan, but nothing felt like an ending. It felt like the start of something larger, something still growing, and the memory of one gym class would echo across stars. Wherever fear met understanding, wherever difference became strength, wherever someone stood and chose to help instead of harm, there, the story of the human would live on. The end.